Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Morning from the Bat Cave. It is 9/2/2020, September 2nd, 2020. I have been meaning to do a series on Hebrews, just because Hebrews is going to be it's really going to be the pinnacle book of the Bible to defend you against the onset of Judaism in the last days. It's often been the book that led a lot of people out of Roman Catholicism. My parents were raised Roman Catholic, and Hebrews is what brought them out of it. But if you understand Catholicism as basically just a new Judaism, it's not hard to see the similarities between the two. So I'm going to go over that whole book just to cover all the references that the author, which I believe is Paul, is telling people. He's warning them basically in his last letter he wrote before he died, don't go back to Temple Judaism. He wrote the book about 5 years before the temple was destroyed, but he knows it's going to be rebuilt again because he knows that the Antichrist needs to sit in that temple and claim that he's God. Okay, so obviously you guys are seeing this growing dissension on the internet between people who believe the Antichrist is going to pretend to be the Messiah and people who believe that the Antichrist is a Muslim. I'm going to work to debunk the Muslim theory in small pieces, just because you guys need to understand that theory was made up after 9/11 by Joel Richardson and Walid Chabot mostly. They peddled it around, made themselves some money, made themselves relatively famous in the prophecy world, but their scholarship is horrible. Joel Richardson's just an out-and-out liar, and Walid Chabot's just an out-and-out liar. I don't just say that lightly. I say that because I've caught them in known lies that you can prove are lies, and most people don't think they don't know better, because most people don't read, most people don't study their Bible, and they just surf the internet or go from book to book, just letting somebody else spoon feed them a truth rather than validating that truth for themselves. So I'm going to teach you guys some basic things about the Table of Nation, linguistics and etymology, so you can do your own research if you have the diligence to do so. If not, at least I want you to have a basic understanding of where my theories come from a basis of scholarship. So I'm not just making up a theory based on the headlines. I'm not just saying something that sounds attractive on its surface, but when you dig beneath the surface, you find out it's just a bunch of BS. Okay. Recently, I invited somebody to watch some of my videos and gave them a lot of information to just digest for themselves, that it's very clear that the Jews are looking to merge, particularly with Christianity and Islam as kind of like secondary religions to Judaism, and they're working towards rebuilding the temple, and they're working towards unifying with the Arabs around them. It's just very obvious if you guys are watching the news. I mean, Jared Kushner and Trump have been making deals ever since they got in office in terms of unifying basically the Jews with the Arab Muslims, not necessarily the North African Muslims or the Persian Muslims or the other Muslims, but the Arab Muslims in particular. They're all starting to get friendly with Israel. And there's a reason, is because there's money and geopolitical involvement there. There's also technology involved in that. And if you understand these things, it makes sense that they unite, but it's something that's unprecedented in world history. Again, the Arabs haven't gotten along with the Jews since Moses married into Midian. That's how old that fighting between them has been. So I'm going to start with the Table of Nations here, and then we're going to get into some things about the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of nations. So what you see here is a pretty good encapsulation of the Table of Nations. Basically, it's color-coded, so the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Most of these people, if you really understand where the ark landed based on the Bible, and landed somewhere in this region, okay? So this region somewhere between eastern Turkey and western Iran is where the ark landed. And it's not a big surprise. This is also where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers start up here. It's not surprised that that's going to be the border of the east and the west when the Antichrist empire ends, because that border starts right up around where the ark landed. Okay, that's the basic starting point of the division for all humanity. So that's why you see so many of these nations clustered around here, is because they all started right here. So Noah starts right here, and it talks about how they traveled. Some versions will say to the east, some will say from the east, to get to Shinar. Well, if you know the rivers that go from there, those rivers are going to flow from the east to the west and then back towards the east, towards the Persian Gulf. Okay, so they're basically just, you guys don't need to know anything super scholarly about linguistics. Just you need to use some common sense. They're starting at the top of the river. And when their tribes or groups get bigger and bigger, they're just mostly going to move downriver. Okay. Japheth was the oldest son, so most of his tribes are going to stay up near the top of the rivers, and downriver from him, you're going to have the Shemites, his younger brother, and then his younger brother was Ham and the Hamites, and they're going to go even further downriver. Then most of these people, what they're going to do is they're going to follow the riverbeds are going to take them to the seacoast, and then they're going to go up and down the seacoast and find other rivers, and that's where they're going to settle. And the reason is very simple. They need fresh water. Okay, that's the number one resource you need if you're going to farm, if you're going to just drink water and survive, right? And obviously, if you're close to a river and a sea, you're close to both fish and river resources. So that's where you're going to settle. So they would just travel downriver and then up and down the various seacoasts, and that's how they would get to where they are. And so what you end up having is the descendants of Shem basically end up going down here, and they're actually down here. I don't know why they've got Dedan as a Shemite or as a Hamite tribe. Dedan and Sheba are actually a Japhethite tribe, but I think both of those ancestries have children named Sheba and Dedan in a pair. But essentially, the Semites are basically going to be up and down the Euphrates River, down here into what is today Canaan, and then down the Red Sea coast and up around here into what's today Yemen. The Cushites are going to really be at the very bottom, or I'm sorry, the Hamites, and Cush is the oldest son of the Hamites, and they're going to be along this Yemeni coast from Cush, which is today would be best known as Sudan. And then they're actually going to travel up here into what today is called Pakistan, okay? So most of these people, these tribes, by the time you get to the Tower of Babel, and I estimate the Tower of Babel to be somewhere around the time pretty closely before Joseph gets sold into Egypt. It's recorded in the book of Genesis before that, but you remember the book of Genesis was written by Moses long afterwards. So he's recording how the nations were dispersed and why the nations were dispersed, and then he's recording the story of Abraham. So they're separate stories. They're not meant to be, the story of Abraham is not meant to be something that takes place after the Tower of Babel. It's just, there's two different stories that are recorded. It's like you record the flood, that's a major thing, and then the Tower of Babel, that's a major thing, and then the ancestry of Abraham, that's a major thing, okay? So the first translator you hear of in all the Bible is when Joseph has translators for his brothers, okay? So somewhere before that is when the confusion of languages happened. Before that, you had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob talking with people from, there was 9 Canaanite tribes, I believe. There are Philistines, which were an Egyptian tribe that he would talk with. He would talk with Aramaeans. You have Job and the descendants of Edom all talking. So it's very clear that all these people at that time spoke the same languages, even though you literally have Shemites and Japhethites here. They have the Philistines. This is bad. The Philistines are not Japhethites. They're an Egyptian tribe. Okay, but anyways, you have all these mixture of languages, and then around the time of Joseph, all of a sudden he needs a translator. Well, why does he need a translator? Well, that's because somewhere around the time, I'm guessing around the time that Joseph was sold into Egypt, the Tower of Babel actually collapsed. They probably would have been building it for hundreds of years because it was supposedly this huge tower that they were working on, and their whole the whole wider economy, which was really, this was the center of the world's economy, was centered around building this great tower. And so what would happen is they're creating all this grain, and they're using the stalks of the grain to build bricks to make this huge tower. But they have this surplus of grain because this is actually, kind of like the farm belt of the world. And then they're selling grain all over the world. So there's just an overabundance of grain, right? Because they're making so much to build this tower, okay? And what ends up happening then is when the confusion of languages happens, the tower, they stop building it. And then these people start dispersing because they can't understand each other. And then that supply chain, which is this grain that was being traded all over the world from there, is now shut down. And so that's why you have the huge famine around the time of Joseph. It's actually the direct result of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. They don't say that flat out in the Bible, but you can just use some common sense and just go, oh, that makes sense that, they would have all this grain because they're using straw for the bricks. You need straw for bricks. And where do you get the straw from? Well, you get it from grain. It's the stalks of the grain you grow, and then you use the grain to feed the people. But you're obviously going to have a ton of grain, so you can sell all this grain, and then you stop selling the grain because the confusion of language happens. These people aren't working together anymore. So most of your nations were clustered around basically Turkey and the Middle East and Egypt. I mean, this is where most of them were. You had some people starting to seafare and starting to explore around there and starting to explore around these northern seacoasts there. But most of them were right here around the Middle East and Turkey, okay? Which is why you have these clusters here. Now, at the time, Nimrod, who's the son of Cush, the Cushites would have been down here in the south, and they would have later spread down here, down these two seacoasts, basically, and going this way towards Africa and this way towards India. And that's why you have darker-skinned people in the south of India and darker-skinned people, obviously, in Africa, because the Hamites generally had darker skin. The Japhethites generally had the lightest skin, and the Semites generally had skin that was kind of in between, brown. And of course, you have all these tribes intermingling and intermarrying, so you have mixtures of languages. But since the Semites are more in the center, they're usually going to have the skin color that's more in the center. Okay, whereas these guys are so far apart already, their skin color is going to get more and more and more distinct as time goes on, which is why there's such a big difference between like a German or an Aryan-looking person or an African-looking person or a Sudanese person. Like, they would be like polar opposites. If you get like a Swedish person and a Cushite person, they're like polar opposites. Well, they were always separated, and the Semites were in the middle of them. So that's why the Semites have a skin tone that's kind of in the middle of them, and these guys get further and further apart the more they spread out, okay? And they probably all had a pretty similar skin tone. Like, if you look at like Afghanistan, it's like not quite black, not quite white. Probably most of your Japhethites were more like that in the beginning, and probably more of your African tribes were probably closer to like Egyptian in the beginning, which was not quite as black as Sudanese. But again, when you have separation, and what happens is those genetic factors get more and more pronounced over time. So skin colors gets lighter or darker, noses get bigger or smaller, eye colors are going to be more distinct, where you might have an occasional kid having blonde hair. Now all the kids have blonde hair, where you might have an occasional kid having, black nappy hair. All the kids are now going to have black nappy hair. And the more isolated they get, the more whatever features are common among them are going to be more and more pronounced over time, okay? So this is Nimrod's empire, and this is where it started. And Nimrod is a son of Cush, okay? And so the Cushites would have been up here, and then of course, when Nimrod fails, basically Abraham actually defeats him in the war, that battle with the 5 kings. One of them, Amraphel, is Nimrod. Okay, Nimrod's just a title, which means the rogue or the rebel, but his real name was Amraphel, according to the Jews. And Abraham beats him and his 5 kings, and so he and all his allies, basically, which are all down here. He had the Elamites, he had Tidal, king of nations, so that was probably the king over this consolidated empire, which was like a mixed nation, were there. And then there was a couple other kings. Well, king of Shinar, which would have been the king of this region, maybe. And then Amraphel was the king of Shinar. So there are 4 or 5 kings. Anyways, Abraham defeats these kings, and then these people are going to spread out even further, and now their languages are confused, so they're going to stick to their own kind much more, okay? People mixed a lot more before the languages were confused. They intermarried a lot more, they traded a lot more, and once the languages were confused, that gets shut down, and people stay pretty isolated for honestly probably the next century or so, okay? So you have a time where people are spread out, they're more isolated, and their physical features and their language features are going to become much more distinct over the next 100 years, okay? In that time, that's the time really that the Jews are in Egypt. So they're kind of isolated from this because they're right in the middle of Egypt, which is a powerful monolithic empire at that time. Because after the Tower of Babel fell apart, the main two empires that rose in its place were the Hittites up here and the Egyptians down here. You didn't have another power arising in the Middle East until the Assyrians, and this is like between 500 and 1,000 years later. Actually, it's probably closer to 1,000 years later when the Assyrians rise again here. The Assyrians were kind of strong, but most of these people right here broke up, and then the main probably empires or kingdoms that are going to rise there are going to be the Elamites right here and the Assyrians right here, but they don't get really big and powerful again for a long time because that's where people were the most mixed up, and so that's where there was the most confusion and probably a lot of fighting and stuff after that, okay? Meanwhile, you have the Hittites who are all one language, and all their brothers are going to be the Canaanites right here. So they've kind of got this barrier between them and Egypt, and they're going to take over this whole region here, and they're going to become the Hittite Empire. The Egyptians obviously are going to take over the Nile, and they're going to become the Egyptian Empire, and those are the two main empires then after that, okay? So by the time you get to the time, this would be the time when the Jews are in Egypt. You really have these main two empires, and then they have this other kingdom called the Mitanni, and I'll be honest, I don't know who the Mitanni are. I haven't done a lot of research on them. So if I had to guess based on their location, the Mitanni are probably a predecessor to the Medes or the Madai. So the Mitanni and Madai might be related. And then later on, they're going to work with Babylon to sack Nineveh. So this would be a Japhethite group here, but they're not really a strong kingdom yet. They don't become strong until really about the time of Daniel, when Darius the Mede comes and sacks Babylon. Before that, the Babylonians and the Medes worked to sack Nineveh, just like a generation before that. So anyways, you have these two main kingdoms here, and as you can see, Canaan was often ruled by Egypt. The Philistines would have actually been the Egyptian garrison, so that would be the tribe that is kind of controlling this. And the Egyptians actually projected power into the seas at different times, and the Philistines, they say they were as far away as Crete and Cyprus, and then they came in here and they colonized this. So this strip here would be the Philistia, or the Gaza Strip here. And from there, that would be the main garrison or the main allies by which the Egyptians would project power into Canaan. And then they would come in here and they'd have these, these supplies coming from these guys on their side. And then they would bring their armies up here and they would fight to hold Canaan against the Hittites. The Hittites are a Canaanite tribe. The Philistines are an Egyptian tribe, okay? And so this whole time that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are here, Canaan is really considered part of Egypt, but it kind of ebbs and flows. If you read like ancient Egyptian history, they'll fight back and forth over this region over the centuries. And then when you get to the Egyptians being in, or the Jews being in Egypt, it's in that time that Egypt really starts to get powerful. And the reason is because you read about the famine, and basically the Egyptians are just really blessed, and they consolidate all this power because of Joseph advising them. Okay, so Joseph advises the Egyptians, and they just keep getting more and more and more powerful. The Hittites are still pretty powerful, but what you have here is these other groups like the Mitanni and eventually the Assyrians are starting to rise up and contend with them. What you also have is, as you can see, the Hittites never controlled this northern stretch. Over here, they would say Troy is either over here or over here. You have the Tyrians, these are a Japhethite tribe, and then the Ionians, which are over here, and they're migrating around here. And then you also have the other Japhethite tribes. Remember, this is a Canaanite or a Hamite tribe. Or Hamite nation, and these other Japhethite nations would roam freely between here and here, and they would often raid this, okay? So just for a frame of reference, when I was in my history degree, the professor that taught me all this stuff, he had a PhD in this Bactrian and Sogdian, and if you know where the Bactrians were, this is the professor that I was raised under. The Bactrians were like a predecessor to the Stan countries, so these would be Turkish-speaking countries, and he would study all their coins and things like that and learn where they spread from because of the coins that they used. And so what he would do is he would prove through his research that these people were always coming down into Turkey, into Persia, and into Greece, just basically circling around on horseback, and then they would eventually they might plant a city here and there, or they might just raid it and then just leave. Okay. So anyways, you always had this region here where Japhethites were coming and going from. They weren't settling there because you always had these empires down here that were constantly taking over. And if an empire was strong there, they would leave. They would go leave and scatter out elsewhere. Okay. So when you get to the Table of Nations dispersion, common sense is like, well, if they're all up here, notice they're all on the top of Turkey, and down here is becoming these different empires at times. Well, they're going to kind of hang out up here, but they're mostly going to leave and go out here. And that's how you get all the people who become the Europeans, mostly the northern Europeans, because the southern Europeans are going to get to where they are by the seacoast. But you're going to have the northern Europeans that are going to get to where they are by horseback. And horse training and horse trading and horse riding had its origin right here. Okay, this is where would be Armenia. And so these guys would take horses down here, around here, and now they could travel a lot further, which means they could be further from their water sources, okay? And so what would end up happening is that these guys would, if you see Magog up here, he was one of them, his descendants would travel over here, and then Togarmah, which is the forefather of the Turks, they would travel down here, and then they would mix right here in the stand countries. So when you have these stand countries, they're kind of a mix of Magog and Togarmah. And you can find that proved by genetics. You can find that proved by language. It's just very common knowledge, okay? And while you have some of those people, you know, from these various Japhethite tribes in the north of Turkey, Turkey is not really their homeland. Turkey is just where they started because the ark was there, and then they migrated out into other places. And the question is, where do they go, okay? Now, before I get into where they went, I want to teach you guys something about, you know, linguistics, okay? So linguistics just means the study of languages, and this is essentially scholars basically are trying to study various connections between languages and words and stuff like that to figure out where languages came from, figure out where people came from, and basically have a better resource to understand history. Okay, that's why, you know, when I went and got a history degree, there was etymology and linguistics in the coursework, because there's a lot of connection between the history of language and the history of peoples and tribes and things like that. Okay, etymology is the study of various words and their origins. And if you guys are interested in the subject matter, if you maybe, you know, you don't have the money to go get a college degree, but you're interested in etymology and linguistics, I want to recommend a channel to you, because this channel is really cool. I found this guy, his name is Bahadur Alast, okay? He has this channel, and he literally will get people, so you see he's got this girl, she speaks Assyrian Aramaic, and this girl speaks Arabic, and they will compare words together and show how these words sound so similar, okay? Here's another one where he does one with between Assyrian Aramaic and Hebrew, and he just has tons of these. I mean, this channel, I mean, between Arabic and Persian, Moroccan, Egyptian, Tunisian, Korean, and Japanese. So this guy just gets people from all over the world, and he sits them down together and shows how similar some of their words are, okay? So if you're interested in etymology and linguistics, there's a certain person who accused me of just making up stuff because they sound alike. I'm not just making this up. This is scholarship. This is research. And this guy dedicates his whole channel to that kind of research. And you can see how all these languages sound similar, or their words sound similar. They're just pronounced slightly different. But some of them still are the exact same words, okay? Even some of these things that are really far away, I mean, Turkish and Greek, Filipino and Indonesian, Assyrian and Persian, Spanish and Portuguese, Russian and Turkish. You know, he gets all these languages, and he shows how similar they still are. Arabic and Portuguese. Remember, the Arabs used to rule Spain, okay, or Muslims used to rule Spain. They were Moorish North African Muslims, but they would have spoke the Arabic language, okay. So So he is very interested in this stuff, and this is just a good channel if you want some free research into this and just to understand some basics of etymology, okay? Now, getting into etymology, I want to show you something that's right in the Bible, where you can understand some stuff about etymology right from the Bible. So, my interest in languages actually started before I was in college, because before I was in college, I worked in a factory here in Michigan, and the factory had probably like 10 different nationalities represented in it. I had a lot of people from Bosnia, and then a couple of brothers were from Albania, so those were two different countries. I had a lot of people from Vietnam, and then a couple people from Laos, so those were two different countries. And I had a guy from China. The factory was run by Germans, and then a lot of people were from Mexico, Guatemala. I had a Puerto Rican there. I had a Cuban there. I think I had Costa Ricans there, but mostly Mexican, Guatemalan, and then a Puerto Rican and a Cuban working there. So I have 4 different Spanish-speaking countries: German, American English, and Bosnian and Albanian spoken around me constantly. And I was there for 4 years, and I was there through most of my undergraduate degree, and I was surrounded by all these different languages. And you learn things just by being surrounded by languages. And one of the things that you learn is that some people just can't pronounce stuff. And that is part of the way that God confused the languages, okay? Now, what God did when he confused the languages, it says he confounded them, or he confused them. He didn't change their language. He didn't just give them a whole new language from scratch. What he did is he rearranged their languages. And basically, God seemed to have done 2 things. One is he changed how people pronounce things. And 2 is he changed the order in which their grammar was structured. So that's why you see some people will put the verb before the noun, and others will put the noun before the verb. The language structures were different, okay? And most of these people didn't have, actually none of them had an alphabet. So you didn't have any kind of phonemes where you could have letters representing individual sounds. Most of them just had symbols, because they all spoke the same language, and so all you need to know is what the symbol meant, kind of like Chinese, right? They had a whole bunch of symbols. Well, once the languages were confused, a language emerged which really seems to have started with Joseph in Hebrew, and then eventually became what is Hebrew, Arabic, and then the phonetic alphabet, and then the phonetic alphabet spread to Greece, and eventually became the Greek and Latin alphabet, and that became the alphabet that's used in most European countries right now. The Hebrew language obviously stayed the Hebrew language, and then the Arabic language, they invented their own script, so they have a different script for their alphabet, but the sounds are actually pretty similar. The phonemes are actually pretty similar to the Hebrew ones, okay? There's a lot of difference to them. I know somebody from the Middle East is going to say to me, "You're crazy. Those are very different." But I'm saying, if you take all the languages in the world together, Arabic and Hebrew are not that terribly different. Same thing as Aramaic and Hebrew and Aramaic, and watch that guy's channel. He'll show you word by word how similar they are. Okay. So one of the things this is in the book of Judges. You had people from, I believe it was from Gilead, and these would have been Judahites, and these were Ephraimites, and they're fighting over something. And while they're fighting, they have a guy who's coming over to them, and he's saying, "Are you an Ephraimite?" Because they're fighting the Ephraimites. And he says, "No, I'm not an Ephraimite." And then they said, "Then say now Shibboleth," and he said Sibboleth, okay? Because one of the things, this is just between 2 different Hebrew tribes. The Ephraimites could not pronounce Sibboleth or Shibboleth. They couldn't say sh, so they just say s, okay? And this is one of the things that God seems to have done between different language groups, is changed how they pronounce things. If you try to get, for instance, somebody from Japan to say an L sound, they're often going to say an R sound. They're going to hear something different, and they're going to say something different. I'll give you an example from my own personal life. I belong to a Native American tribe on my mom's side, okay? And this tribe has 2 different names. Chippewa is what the English called them, and Ojibwa is what the French called them, okay? And if you know where my tribe is based in Michigan, my tribal group once controlled most of the UP, most of the southern peninsula of Michigan. Oops, sorry, move my face. my tribal group once controlled most of this area over here and most of this area over here. So all around the Great Lakes in Canada and in Michigan was controlled by my tribe called the Chippewa or Ojibwe, okay? Well, up here is controlled by, was mostly, most of these cities were planted by the French. And down here, most of this was colonized by English or Americans, okay? Now, I happened to meet a woman who was a PhD and taught French in this town of Sudbury here, and she taught me some things about the French language. Well, the French language, they always put vowels at the beginning of things because they want it to flow very smoothly, and so they'll just add an O or an A at the beginning of a word while they're writing it, and even though the word is Jibway, you can see how Jibway and Chipway, they sound similar, but they're spelled differently. So you have CH here and you have J here, right? You have Chippewa A and you have Chippewa E here. Well, the French will pronounce an E like the English will pronounce an A. Okay? The French will pronounce a B like the English will pronounce a P. The French will pronounce a J like the English will pronounce a CH. Chippewa. Okay, so Chipway, Chipway, Chippewa, Chippewa, and then the French will put an O on there. Ojibwa. Okay, so that's my personal tribe. So I have a tribe, and I can show you a card that says I'm from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. We're not even Indians. Okay, Columbus made a mistake there. And then, but for some reason, one person calls it Ojibwe and another person calls it Chipway, but it's the same language. Well, you're going to find this all over the world. You're going to find these similarities. And the reason is this. All these people have very different languages and very different alphabet scripts or symbolic languages or however they represent their language. And then what happens is most of the world essentially gets colonized by really, or it's either get colonized or conquered by really Europeans, Russians, to a large degree Chinese, but basically the Japhethite peoples, okay? And that was actually prophesied about the Japhethite people, that basically they'd be the biggest tribe, but they would dwell in the tents of Shem. Well, the Japhethites mostly converted to Christianity. You have most of your Europeans and Russians are converted to Christianity. Most of your sons of Gomer are converted to Christianity. And then the ones that really aren't are the Tagarman and the Medes or the Kurds that are converted to Islam, okay? But they're still Semitic religions. Okay, so they're all dwelling in the tents of Shem. Okay, so when you have these different people groups, you're going to have them describing things very different. Now, the reason I want to get into this because there's this really just ignorant idea that has started with Joel Richardson and is now being promoted by Wally Chabot and another person who I hope watches this video. Not trying to embarrass you, I'm just trying to educate you, okay? That Gog and Magog are right here in Turkey. Well, why would you think that? And I'm going to show you exactly why they think that. I'm going to walk you through the actual work. If you don't want to take the time to educate yourself and you follow the links I showed you, I'm going to show you exactly why they think that. The reason is because in the 6th and 7th century, there was this guy named Gyges of Lydia, okay? Well, Gyges of Lydia, some scholar in the 1960s said, well, Gyges might be Gog. Okay, that's what he suggested in his book. Okay, so you have this guy, it says, the name of the Lydian king, Gyges, Guju, king of the Ludi, okay, it says, many biblical scholars believe that Gyges of Lydia was the biblical figure of Gog, the ruler of Magog. And the reason they say these many biblical scholars believe this is because this is the 6th century, and this is around the time that Ezekiel was written. It's near the same time. But Ezekiel is writing a prophecy about the last days. Why would he be writing about a contemporary king in Turkey who nobody's ever heard of and has never really done anything famous? Did he invade Israel? No. Okay, but not only that, if you see, the annals of the Assyrian Ashurbanipal, remember the Assyrian was a Semitic tribe, refer to Guju, king of Ludi, okay, not king of Magog, king of Ludi. Okay, so what they do is they say, well, we think Gyges is Gog, and so therefore we think Ludi is Magog. That's dumb. Okay, Ludi is Lud, and if you go to the original table of nations and you find any table of nations chart, you would know. See, this is Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian in the time of 70 AD. That's not the best rendering. But you would see that, do you see any Lud here? You see there's Magog, he's the son of Japheth. Do you see Lud here? And the answer is no. You have Luddites in Ham, which are in North Africa. And then you also have Lud here, which is in the sons of Shem, okay? And the Assyrians, Ashurbanipal is an Assyrian. He has a brother named Lud, okay? So Arphaxad is where you get the Iraqis from. Ashur is where you get the Assyrians from. Elam is where you get the Persians from. And Lud is where you get the Lydians from. And Aram is where you get the Arameans from, okay? So how you have this original dispersion of people, you have the Arameans, that's going to be the area of Syria. Arphaxad, that's going to be the area of Iraq. Elam is going to be the area of Persia. Ashur is going to be the area of Assyria. And Lud is going to be this area in western Turkey. Well, why don't we hear much about Lud in history? And the answer is because if you remember what I told you, is the Hittites took over this whole area and turned it into an empire. So they subjugated the Lydians or the Luds, right? The Ludi or the Lydians, they subjugated them, and you don't hear about them for hundreds of years until after the Hittite kingdom falls. And then they start to reemerge in this kingdom called Lydia. So now you have this kingdom of Lydia that emerges after the Hittites fall, and they would basically conquer western Turkey. Okay, and this Gyges was their king of Lydia. Okay, now do you see anything about Gog or Magog here? And the answer is no, because where are the Magogians? Well, the Magogians are way up here. No matter what you get, you're going to get all these maps. Magogians are going to be up here, because the Magogians were well known to be the horse riding people, and they would come and invade down here once in a while, but then they would go back. Now, if you read Herodotus, and Herodotus was a ancient Greek historian who wrote at the time, around the time when the Greeks and the Persians were fighting before Alexander the Great, okay? And so he knew a lot about the Persians. He would write these stories. Let's see if I can find... So Herodotus would write about these Scythians, and what they would do is they would invade the area of Turkey. They would invade the area of Greece on their horsebacks, and then when the Persian Empire would start to fight them, they would just take their horses, and they would flee from them up into Asia, and they would keep falling back and falling back and falling back until this army was too far away from their supply lines, and then they would send in their horses, just like the Mongols would do. They would keep going farther and farther away, and then they would shoot at them with their arrows, and then they would get them so far away from their supply lines that then they would surround their supply lines and cut them off from their supply lines, and then they would just circle them miles and miles around, shooting arrows at them, okay? That's how the Mongols fought. That's how the Scythians fought. They were using these battle tactics for literally thousands of years, okay? Basically, they're the same battle tactics that the Russians used to beat Napoleon and Hitler, because the Russians learned those tactics from the Mongols and the Scythians that came before them. These tactics were used, look at, these tactics were used so effectively that the Mongols formed this massive empire. This is the Mongol Empire, okay? The reason it's so big, I mean, you're seeing all the way over here, this is basically Eastern Europe, all the way into China. They conquered most of China. They conquered all these Turkic countries. They conquered Persia. They conquered most of Turkey, okay? This is how much the Mongols conquered, okay? And the reason is because whenever somebody would get a big army to go against them, they would just go back into their lands, and then they'd surround that army and shoot them with arrows, just like I showed you, okay? They would just surround the army, shoot them with arrows all around, cut off their supply lines, and then it'd basically be like a siege, but you don't even have any walls or supplies. And they'd just defeat everybody that way. Well, you can create an empire that way, but you can't hold it. And so this empire essentially dissolved within, I want to say, like 100 years, and then in its place rose the Russian Empire, basically based around the Muscovites, and then they eventually conquered most of that, and obviously China kind of absorbed the remainder of it over here, and then these stand countries were broken down, and then Persia rearose, and then after that, Turkey rearose when the Turks conquered not Salahuddin, but Solomon the Magnificent. Basically, those guys grew Turkey to be a kingdom. So, but before that, the Mongols controlled all this. Okay. Well, when the Mongols controlled all of this, you had this guy Marco Polo, who was this famous Italian scholar who traveled all the way to China. Okay. Well, he's not the only one that did that. Another one is this Islamic guy, and his name is Ibn Battuta, okay? And I used to have a book by him. I lost it, but this guy Ibn Battuta, basically he traveled the known world during the Mongol period too. And what he discovers is this Great Wall of China, okay? Because the Great Wall of China existed in 200 BC. So by the time this wall has been around for around 1,500 years by the time the Khans had taken over, and the Islamic Caliphate right now is about 500 years old now, and Ibn Battuta is traveling now this Khanate here, and you don't realize this. People talk about this great caliphate. Well, most of this caliphate was conquered by the Khans, okay? And then the Europeans pushed most of the Muslims out here, so most of Islam was between the Arabian Peninsula and here. And then a lot of these Khans, which were a mixture of Mongols and Turks, converted to Islam, and that's why you have all these Turkish people in Central Asia and Turkey and stuff like that, all being Muslim now. They converted to Islam. These ones over here were all Buddhists. They converted to Tibetan Buddhism, but these ones over here, the Kagadi Khanate and the Il Khanate, they converted to Islam, and that's why you hear the name Khan in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Persia. It's a very common name because Khan is just the Mongol word for king. Okay, so they would have been people who were somehow related to the king. Well, if you were the king, you would get all the wives you want and have tons of kids and have sex with whoever you want, and your kids would all have your name Khan. Okay, and that was one of the ways that they ruled. And so you have Persians and Afghanistanians and Pakistanis who are all intermingly related to the Mongol Khans, okay? You notice where they're not quite as much, though, is Turkey. You don't have that until after the Khanate Empire's fall that Turkey gets sacked. Turkey is still pretty free. Constantinople is still a free city. The Muslims rule most of the stuff around it, but they're not, the city of Constantinople is still Greco-Roman, okay? So anyways, Ibn Battuta discovers the Great Wall of China, and all of a sudden this legend exists among the Muslims of Juj and Majuj in the Great Wall, okay? Juj and Majuj, okay? So Juj and Majuj is the Muslim version of Gog and Magog. And they had this myth now with this great wall that kept out Juj and Majuj. You see the wall being built here? Well, most of the Muslims don't know their history, and they don't know how far away this wall is, and so they invent this legend that Alexander the Great built this wall to keep out Gog and Magog. Okay, and so that's where this idea that Gog and Magog are right above them in the Caucasus came from. But if you understand why they believe that, it's because the Mongols were up here. Okay, so they have this legend of a wall right here to keep out the Mongols, which are Gog and Magog, but that wall is really over here in China. They got it from Ibn Battuta, okay? So what happens is you have this, so we're done with Gyges. You have the Muslims start forming this legend about this wall, this imaginary wall that's up here, because that's where the Mongols are coming and attacking them. So they think, they know rightly that the Mongols are Magog, but they think because the Mongols are attacking them right here, that there used to be this wall here that Alexander the Great built that the Mongols broke down. Well, there was never a wall. Alexander the Great never built a giant, massive, hundreds of miles long wall. Okay, he fought for about 7 years and then he died. Okay, he fought battles for 7 years, went back to Babylon, and died of alcohol poisoning. Okay, so he never did this. Okay, but these Muslims are ignorant and they're making stuff up, and they're experiencing the Mongols invading from here, so they imagine this wall to be here. Well, the wall that they're really imagining is the Great Wall of China. So the Great Wall of China is humongous and world-renowned, and it's been around for 1,500 years. You can see it from outer space. It's so big. And the Chinese are trying to keep out two people. One is this big kingdom here that used to be, see, this is North Korea, and this would have been Manchuria, but it's called Goguryeo. Okay, Goguryeo. Okay, and pay attention to that. The other one see, some people call it Goguryeo, okay? Some people are going to transliterate the G into the G, and so you have Goguryeo, okay? And then the other, next to it, you have Mongolia, okay? So Gog and Magog are Goguryeo and Mongolia. Okay, that's how they are, but you got to remember, these places were discovered by various European peoples from the east and the west, and they all spelled it different, just like they spell my tribe Chippewa different, okay? So some people called it Goguryeo, other people called it Goguryeo, and then eventually these people just called it Goryeo, and that's where the name Korea comes from. Goryeo is just Goryeo, and it changes to Koryu, and then it eventually changes to Korea, okay? And that's where the name Korea comes from, okay? Mongolia and Manchuria are the same place. They're just called that by different people. The Japanese called it Manchukuo. The Koreans called it Manchuria, or the Northern Chinese called it Manchuria, and the Eastern Chinese called it Mongolia. Okay, and remember how I said if you tell somebody from Korea or Japanese to pronounce an L, they're going to pronounce an R. So pronounce Mongolia, they're going to say Mongoria. Mongoria. And another person is going to say Manchuria. And another person is going to see the CH from Manchuria and say Manchuria. Okay? And it's all the same place. So you had these people called the Goguryeo next to Mongolia, and there's Gog and Magog right there. And then there were these other people, because remember, these people would travel all over the place, and they would mix with the Turkish peoples, okay? And so you had another people called the Gok Turks, okay? The Gok Turks. That's the Gog Turks. They were a mixture of Gogs and Turks, okay? And the Gog Turks had an empire, not really an empire, but they had influence over territories from Mongolia and Goguryeo to the Gog Turks right here. And these are the stand countries. All these stand countries or the Gog Turks, okay? So they're mixtures of Gog or Magog and Turks, okay? So Gog was the chief prince of Magog. So these people would go back and forth, and these people had very different names over the centuries. At one point, they were called Scythians, and that was the most common name that they were known by Herodotus and by Josephus, and even Paul mentions them in Colossians 3. If you get to, in Colossians 3, he says to them, there is neither Greek nor Jew, okay, so those were considered Jew, and then the civilized Gentiles. Barbarians were considered the uncivilized Gentiles, and then the Scythians were considered the most uncivilized people. They were these roving hordes of dangerous Mongols, basically, okay? They were scared of these people. The Scythian were considered, the barbarians were considered the uneducated tribes and nations around the Greco-Roman world. And the Scythians were considered like these, they would consider almost like the Vikings or pirates or whatever. Like they were completely barbarian, okay? Like they were just dangerous, and they were like animals, okay? So he'd basically say there's neither Greek nor Jew, barbarian or Scythian, bond or free, but Christ is in all and in all. So the Scythians, if you understood where these people were, well, the Greeks were in the Greco-Roman world. The Jews were obviously the Jews. The barbarians would have been the uncivilized tribes like the Germans, around them. And Barbar literally meant the Babel. It's a transliteration of the word Babel, so the babblers, essentially the people who speak these strange babbling languages. And the Scythians were always these horse raiders who came from far, far away and would invade you and then leave, okay? So those were the people, even in Paul's day, that they understood these Scythians. Well, one of the people, if you look at Scyth, is not too far from Scot, okay? And modern etymologists and linguists have figured out, and now they're doing this with genetics too, so they know this for certain where these people come from, that the Scythians were actually, or the Scottish, so there you have the Scots and Scotland's, they claim the Scythians as their empires. Well, how do you connect Scottish people with Magog? Well, if you understand a Scottish last name, my mother's last name is Scottish, and it is MacGowan, okay? All Scots have this at the beginning of their family name, Mac, okay? Do you see how Mac from the Scottish might be like Mag from the Mongols, okay? And one of the people that came from the Mongols or the Magogians were these people called the Magyars, okay? So again, the Scots have Mac, these key people have Magyars, okay? So Mag would have been their chief name, that they're all Magogians, so they would have Mag or Mac at the beginning, right? And then they would have their tribal name after that. So the Magyars are apparently those tribes. But the Magyars were the predecessors of the Hungarians. And the Hungarians have a, bear with me. The Hungarians are basically claiming to their ancestry from Attila the Hun. So the Huns, which were these Magyar people, and the Huns were a type of Magog or Mongolian, okay? And the Huns, there's actually up in Korea a Han River. It's in northeastern China, the Han River. See, there's this big river right here called the Han River. Well, what was this land back in that day? Well, that was Goguryeo. So the Huns were another people who came from Gog. So you had the Huns, you had the Mongols, and eventually you're going to have this chief prince of Magog when you get to Ezekiel 38, okay? So notice how far away we are from Turkey here, right? All this stuff is, there's some linguistic and there's some ethnic links to Turkey, but we're so far away from Turkey here, okay? Why do they think it's Turkey? And the reason is because this one guy with this King Gyges, that's where it started, and then the person who popularizes it is this guy, Joel Richardson, okay? This is pretty much the only guy who's popularizing this theory that the Turks are Gog and Magog. Okay, this is the only guy who's really popularizing that right now, and other people are following him and they're repeating what he's saying. But he has a problem because nothing in the Bible connects Gog and Magog with Turkey, nothing whatsoever. Okay, all he has is this King Gyges of Lydia, which Lud was a Semitic tribe and Magog is a Japhethite tribe. Okay, so it doesn't connect at all. So what does he do? Is he goes and finds this prophecy about Agag. Okay? And this is a prophecy by Balaam in the book of Numbers about Agag. And it says they're trying to curse Israel. They're trying to pay him to curse Israel. And he gives them this prophecy instead that says, he shall pour water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. So the seed is going to be the seed of the Lord. And this is actually a prophecy about really Christianity and the Lord being Christ, okay? And then it says, his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Well, who is Agag? Well, Agag is the title name for the kings of the Amalekites. Well, why is he saying he's going to be over Agag, the Amalekites? And the answer is because this is the same prophecy. Look at when he says, and when I looked on Amalek, he took up this parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nation, but his latter end shall be to perish forever. So we know King Agag is king of the Amalekites, and so he says, Agag, look at this. This is Psalm 24:7 and Psalm 24:20. He mentions Agag, and then he mentions the Amalekites. Why? Because Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And Samuel actually kills King Agag. And the Amalekites were considered the first of the nations, and they were also the first enemy of the nation of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So God vowed to destroy them forever. Okay? So this is very crystal clear if you just read the Bible and you just look up Agag, that Agag is the Amalekites, has nothing to do with Gog or Magog. Well, Joel Richardson comes up with these alternative translations of the Septuagint and the Aramaic Bible that no modern scholarship will accept, and says that this isn't Agag, this is Gog. Okay? So he takes this one prophecy and he tries to attach Gog somehow to Turkey and to Islam. There is no connection between Gog and Islam. None whatsoever. What you have connection between is Gog and Magog, which is Japhethite tribes, which are allied with the Muslims, okay? And so when you get to Ezekiel 38 and you're understanding this prophecy, and it says, set your face against Gog in the land of Magog, so that's Goguryeo or Korea and Mongolia, which also encompassed all of Russia. The chief prince of Meshech, that's Moscow, and Tubal, that's Tbilisi, that's the capital of Georgia. He says, thus saith the Lord, I am against thee, O Gog, Meshech, and Tubal. So all of these people here, all of these, Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, are the most northern nations. They're in the most northern nations of all of the table of nations. You literally have the Mongols, you have the Muscovites, you have the Georgians, which are just below Russia, and then you have, some translates, this chief here is actually the word Rosh, which is Russian, which would be the Belarusians and the Ukrainians. These are all the most northern tribes in the table of nations. And what does he say they come from? He said, all of thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in all sorts of army, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Okay? So, horsemen clothed with armor, what do you have is you have a description of the Mongols. Okay? So whoever this invasion is in the last days is going to be kind of like the Mongol invasion, which took over all of this. Well, what is all of this right now? And the answer is China, Korea, the Turkish countries, and Russia. Okay? It's like the Mongols. Okay? So, but this is going to be in the last days like the Mongols. So Joel Richardson doesn't want you thinking about the Mongols or their empire at all. He wants you thinking about Turkey. Okay? Because he's trying to point everything to this Islamic invasion and this Islamic Antichrist, which he made up after 9/11. Okay? So, when you get here, the important thing is to say all of them handling swords. Okay? Now we're going to get into their allies from Africa and the Middle East. Okay? Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Where are their swords? These guys have bucklers and shields and swords. These guys have shield and helmet, no swords. Why? Because where do these guys get their weapons from? Here's why Islam is not going to take over the world. They don't even know how to make their own guns. They have to buy them. They have to trade oil to buy guns. They don't even have their own guns. Okay? They get their guns. Who do they get their guns from? Who do they get their nuclear weapons from? Who do they get their defense missiles from? Who do they get their planes from? Who do they get all of their weapons from? The answer is they get them from these people. Moscow and Gog, North Korea. That's where they get all their weapons from, is Moscow and North Korea. Okay? That's why the Persians are working with the North Koreans right now on nuclear technology. They're working with Russia on missile technology. They get their weapons from these people, from the Japhethites in the north. That's why these guys have swords, and these guys just have shields and helmets. They don't have swords. They don't get weapons. They don't make their own weapons, okay? Then it says Gomer and all his bands in the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, okay? They're not going to consider Turkey the north quarters because that's right next to them in the Middle East. The north quarters, they're going to consider the Turks that are out here. These Turks right here. So those are all your stand countries, okay? The people right here are not going to consider this the north quarters. They're literally talking about the north quadrant of the earth, okay? So they're talking over here, these Turks. And so what you have is you have your stand peoples, you have your Russians, you have your Mongolians, but they're kind of sparse today, and then you have your North Koreans, which are Gog, okay? So these people are all going to come against them. And this is not some small local invasion, because what it says is that this is going to be if you read the corresponding prophecy in Joel chapter 2, this is the same invasion. It says, it's a great people and strong, and there has not ever been the like, neither will shall be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. This is the biggest army the world has ever seen. Is that Islam? No. You get all the Muslims in all the world, and it adds up to about 1 billion people. Okay? All the Muslims in the world couldn't field an army, even if they were all united, which they never are, and they never will be, because they're always fighting amongst themselves. Even if they were, they never are going to get an army as big, the biggest army the world's ever seen. China by themselves could field a bigger army than all the Muslims put together, which is why the Muslims don't dare mess with China. Ever. They never, ever, ever mess with China. Because China could field a bigger army than all the Muslim nations put together. China could conquer all the Muslim nations if they wanted to. There's so many Chinese people. Okay, there are more Chinese people than there are of all the Muslim nations put together. There are more Indians than all the Muslim nations put together. That's why they fight, but they don't ever try to conquer India. Because in India, they beat up the Muslims, and they do the same thing that the Muslims do to Christians in the Muslim countries, they do to the Muslims in the Indian countries. Okay? The Indians aren't scared of the Muslims, and the Chinese aren't scared of the Muslims. Okay? There's so many more Indians and Chinese than there are Muslims. Nobody's scared of them. Okay? It's only in the West where we turn them into this magical boogeyman because we needed a new boogeyman to replace the Soviet Union. That's why we talk about him so much in America. That's why Joel Richardson can sell his made-up hack theory. Okay? This is the greatest army the world has ever seen. It's not just Muslims. Okay? Could the Turks and the Libyans and the Kushites field the biggest army the world's ever seen? No. If you take that and you just have Turkey, Iran, Libya, and Sudan, could they field the biggest army the world's ever seen? The answer is no. Okay, you have this massive army, and you have this well-suited army because they're getting all their weapons and stuff from North Korea and Russia. So they come from Togarmah in the north quarter. Gomer is Armenia. That's a Russian ally. And Togarmah is going to be all the stand countries. So that's why it says the house of Togarmah, not just Togarmah. Okay? It's going to be all the stand countries. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, all those countries. Okay? And then it says, after many days you shall be visited. In the latter years you shall come to a land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. Okay? All these nations are going to come against Israel. They're not just coming against Israel, though. This is the biggest army the world has ever seen. They're not just coming against Israel. This is World War III. This prophecy is focused on Israel, but if you understand everything that's being talked about here, this prophecy affects a lot of people in the world. And that's why you have Sheba and Dedan, that's the Arabs, and the merchants of Tarshish, that is the Americans. With all the young lions thereof, the merchants of Tarshish and all the young lions thereof. Well, if you know all the British colonies, that includes Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, and South Africa, they all used to be merchant colonies of Britain. And Tarshish is Britain. All your historical scholars know the Tarshish was Spain and Britain. That's what it was in ancient times. And all the young lions thereof, well, all the colonies of the Spanish and the British came to where are most of them? In the Western Hemisphere. All the Spanish colonies are in the southern part, and all the British colonies are in the northern part. Okay, North America and South America. Okay, so all the young lions thereof are saying, are you come to take a spoil? Why? Because they're not on the same side as this. Okay? And not only that, they're also attacking them. Okay, all this stuff, when you hear about people coming to take a spoil, if you go to Jeremiah 49, he says, arise and get up, you wealthy nation that dwelleth without care and has neither gates nor bars, which dwell alone. Does that sound familiar? It sounds exactly like what Ezekiel says, okay? He says, and I say to them, go up to a land of unwalled villages, go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, neither having bars or gates, to take a spoil, to take a prey. Okay? Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish are saying with the young lions, are you come to take a spoil? So where else are they going besides Israel? They're not just going to Israel. Why are these guys? They're not saying, are you come to take a spoil from Israel? They're saying, are you coming to take a spoil from us? Okay? So does Arabia dwell with walls or gates, or do they dwell securely? They dwell securely. Does America dwell with walls or gates, or do they dwell securely? They dwell securely. Okay, these people are coming against America and against Arabia, and you have this right in Jeremiah 49, because when you see this, he says, "I will break the bow of Elam." Who's Elam? That's Persia. Okay, does Persia fight against Arabia? Yes. Okay, and you can just see that this is about Arabia because he says concerning Kedar. Kedar concerning the kingdoms of Hazor. Well, you want to know who Kedar is? Kedar is the firstborn of Ishmael. I'm sorry, the secondborn of Ishmael, Kedar. Well, where's the secondborn of Ishmael living? In Arabia. Okay? So he's not just coming against Israel, he's also coming against Israel, Arabia, and America. Okay? Because they're all allies right now. I mean, Trump, Kushner, and Ben Salman, or whatever his name, they're all tight, they're all thick as thieves. Those are the three allies that all this army is going to come against. Okay? Gog, Magog, and then Persia and all the fundamentalist Muslims are gonna join Russia and North Korea and probably China to an extent in World War III. And it's going to be them against America, the Arabs, and the Jews. And all the stuff is forming right now. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. You can just read the headlines, but you start with the Bible. Start with what the Bible says, and then you won't get confused. If you start with what Joel Richardson says, he takes books by Ephraim the Syrian and books by Hippolytus of Rome, and he says they have nothing to do with any kind of Jewish Antichrist, okay? And if you go to Ephraim the Syrian, and I document this in my book, Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome, and likely Augustine all continued the early church tradition that the Antichrist was to be of Jewish descent. The tradition of the Jewish Antichrist would likely come from the tribe of Dan, was reinforced throughout the Jewish ages. So why do these people believe this? Why do these people believe that the Antichrist was a Jewish Antichrist from the tribe of Dan? Because the bishop, the earliest expounders of Antichrist, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, taught that the Antichrist would be a Jew. Do you know who Hippolytus and Irenaeus is? They were taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John, who wrote the book of Revelation. Okay? These guys were literally taught by the student, the most well-known student of John the Apostle, who wrote the book of Revelation. And they both said that the Antichrist would be a Jew, specifically from the tribe of Dan. I've read their original works. Go read Irenaeus' Against Heresies. Go read Hippolytus on Christ and Antichrist. And they're both going to tell you he's from the tribe of Dan. Then this other guy, remember, look at Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome, all the early church fathers all believed that he would be an Antichrist of Jewish descent from the tribe of Dan. Okay? All the ancient church readers believe this. Okay? The problem is that now people say, well, that's anti-Semitic. You can't say that because that's anti-Semitic. What if it's true? I don't care what's anti-Semitic. I care what's true. Well, you can go look at, these are all on LibriVox on audio, and you can listen to them yourself. On Christ and Antichrist, you can listen to the whole book in an hour and 20 minutes, okay? And that book is going to tell you that it's the Antichrist is from the tribe of Dan. He's going to rebuild the temple. He's going to flatter the Jews. And then he's going to sit in the temple and claim that he's God, and afterward attack the Jews, which is exactly what Chris White says, which is why Joel Richardson is calling him anti-Semitic, okay? I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not appealing to scholarship against wisdom. I'm appealing to the Bible, and this guy is distorting and changing the Bible to try to fit his theory. It's not. There is no prophecy about Agag that means Gog. It's about Agag, the king of the Amalekites, which Samuel killed. So, learn the Mongols and the Magyars, learn the Scythians, learn Magog and Gog, then learn about the Great Wall of China, and you guys, use some common sense. Goguryeo, okay? The Great Wall of China is right here. Look at this. Goguryeo, Magals, which is a former word for the Mongols, Gok Turks, Goguryeo. Do you think Gog and Gog might be closer related to Gog than Gyges? Yes. Okay. Do you think Magals or Mongols might be closer related to Magog? Yes. Do you think China might have built a massive hundreds and hundreds of miles long wall to protect themselves from Gog and Magog? Juj and Majuj? The answer is yes. They built this wall right here to protect themselves from these massive empires of horse raiders who would keep coming in and attacking their people and then leaving. Okay? So they built the wall so they couldn't just keep coming in and attacking them and then leaving. They built the massive Great Wall of China. I mean, this thing This is the biggest wall in the world. You can see it from space. Look how big this thing is. Do you think that might have stopped horse raiders from coming in? Yup. And they had guys who are always walking up and down this thing with arrows to would tell you if the horse raiders were trying to come in. And they would not let them in that wall. You could not get up it from the side. You'd have to scale this wall, and it's just too much work. And then you couldn't just jump on you couldn't bring your horses with you. Okay? That's the whole reason they built this thing, is so these horse raiders couldn't just come in and out with their horses. Okay? That's Gog and Magog for you. This is not hard to understand. So again, Gog is not Turkey. Gog is North Korea. Magog is not Turkey. Magog is Mongolia. Learn your Bible. Gog is not the Antichrist. Gog is not the Antichrist, and Gog is not Islamic. He's neither of those things. Okay? Joel Richardson's a hack. People who are following and spreading around his theories because they think Islam is the scariest thing imaginable, they ain't seen nothing yet. Okay? When the Antichrist comes, they're going to be like, Islam who? They're not going to be scared of that at all. Okay? So, again, learn your Gog Turk and Mongolia are Gog and Magog. Gogoryu, Mongolia, Gog Turk, these are all Mongolia. Okay? This is Gog and Magog. I don't know why there's so much scholarship that supports that this is Gog and Magog. And Turkey's not a part of it. Okay? Know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Don't be deceived by this Islamic Antichrist theory, because what this theory is going to do is it's going to get you to believe that once Gog and Magog are defeated, well, who defeated them? Well, according to Joel Richardson, Christ defeated them. The problem is Christ didn't defeat them. God is going to save Israel from Gog and Magog, but what's going to end up happening is the Antichrist is going to rise after that and claim that he defeated them. But guess what? If this army falls, and you guys are going to see this in your lifetime, probably in the next 10 years, if this army falls and you don't see Jesus coming in the clouds, this is really simple. That guy's the Antichrist. Don't try to process your theory and think that this is Christ because Gog and Magog are defeated. That happens before Christ comes. And if you know your Bible, it happens 7 years before Christ comes, because you're going to find a 7-year period after this. Anyone who tells you that Gog and Magog is Turkey or Islam or the Antichrist, you need to ask them this. What is the 7 years? What is the 7 years? What is the 7 years? Don't leave them alone about it. Say, what is the 7 years? It's Daniel's 70th week. Ask them what their theory is, and then tell them to validate that theory with Scripture. What's the 7-year period that comes after that? If you read my book, I clearly validate how it's Daniel's 70th week with like 15 different witnesses, okay? But ask them to make up a theory off the top of their head about what the 7 years is. Because there's only one prominent 7-year period in the Bible, and that's Daniel's 70th week. Okay, it's in the latter days, right before this 7-year period. Why? Because it's before Daniel's 70th week. It leads to the rise of Antichrist, okay? That's all I got to say today. I hope you guys are blessed by this. Hope you're edified and strengthened by it. But you're not going to have a lot of allies if you're trying to preach true eschatology. There's going to be a lot of confusion in the world and a lot of other ideas that sound better. Just stay strong and stay persistent in the truth, and it will prove itself in time. Okay? Hope you're blessed by this. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.